Barker. Bonnet.
Here.
Fox.
Here.
Kauth.
Here.
Kennedy.
Here.
McPherson.
Present and delighted.
Morgan is absent. Pendrell.
Here.
Plucker. He's absent. Prestai.
Here.
Quinn.
Here.
Reddick. He's absent. Salgado.
Here.
Sotolongo.
Here.
Kratz.
Here. Okay, let's come to order. The Open Meetings Act requires that we have the act in the room. It is in this room. It's over there. So if anybody has any questions about the Open Meetings Law, you can grab and take a look at it. Everybody on the committee should have received minutes from the last meeting. Is there a motion to approve?
Second.
Okay. God, do we need to vote? Did we vote last time on this? We did, okay. Let's go through the voting then.
Okay. Barker.
Yes.
Bonnet.
Yes.
Fox. Kauth.
Yes.
Kennedy.
Yes.
McPherson.
Yes.
Morgan is absent. Pendrell.
Yes.
Plucker. Absent. Prestai.
Yes.
Quinn.
Yes.
Reddick is absent. Salgado.
Yes.
Sotolongo.
Yes.
Kratz.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Okay, we're now going to go into discussion of some charter suggestions from the city staff and then from the election commissioner. You know, originally we had thought about breaking this up into four different groups and putting the suggestions before the committee, before the groups. We've decided that, at least from the city and the staff standpoint and election commissioner, we'll run it for the whole committee. And then as we get suggestions from the public, we'll divide those and put those into the various groups, and then we'll get into our subcommittee reports and meetings. We thought this might be more efficient to run it in this manner. With that, we're going to have a discussion from the city staff. Mr. Indenbosch, I believe you're going to briefly present for the city.
And I do mean briefly. Bernard Indenbosch, Deputy City Attorney. Each of you did receive a copy of a memo that had a summary of suggested charter revisions from city staff that detailed a whole bunch, and obviously we've itemized each of those individually on the agenda. I will try to provide at least a little bit of background for each. Some may need more background than others. If there's additional background that the commission would like, I will be happy to go ahead and secure it if it's more than what we're able to provide today. So the first one on the agenda, Charter Section 8.08, that's this charter section that requires that each employee, officer, give an oath. It's the same oath that all of you took when you commenced your service. There's been a recommendation from the Human Resources Department that the oath of office be removed as an obligation. There are probably times that we would need to have an oath, but we could certainly do it for particular requirements under state statute. But anyway, that is a request from them. They're the ones who administer this, and they've at least asked to engage in that particular discussion. I think there's a second question that could be addressed, and that is whether the oath, if we're going to continue to have it, whether the oath is appropriate to rewrite or not rewrite. Obviously, the oath is fairly old in its origin, and maybe there's questions as to whether it's outdated or not. That may be a subsequent discussion, but in any event, they asked that the Charter Convention consider removing the oath as a requirement.
Bernard,
Yes. Yep.
based on intent, what's the justification? Because, well, let's start there.
I think the justification, I think what the reason they made the request is the administrative burden that they feel by having to take the oath and maintain a copy of the oath for each of the city's employees. I mean, no more complicated than that.
This would only be at the what level?
Well, I mean, the request from them is for everybody. I mean, obviously, the Charter Convention, if it wanted to get into it, could consider keeping the oath for mayors, council members, and officers and not have it for employees. Again, you have some discretion as what you wanted to do. Obviously, the part that they view, I think, is burdensome to them is maintaining is having to prescribe the oath to all employees, keeping in mind that there's a number of part-time employees that come in that are only here, lifeguards in the summer and whatever else, and you have to make sure that the oath occurs prior to the time that such employee starts, and then you have to maintain that oath in the file.
How is it any more burdensome than any other HR function that they have to do, whether it's EEOC, whatever it is, it's just part of what they're supposed to be doing?
It's always fun. I think it is certainly one of several things that has to be done when employment started. Most things have become are electronic anymore. This one they still maintain in a paper copy. So, from that regard, they have not been able to digitize it, and I think that's probably what it is. But in reality, you're probably right. I mean, it's they made the request. It comes forward to you.
And we're dialoguing about it. So this
absolutely.
is McPherson. And so my question is part B of intent. The role of that oath is to remind you of what you're signing up for. And it is to put you on notice the responsibility, the awesome responsibility that you have. I have read that oath a number of times, and it makes me reflect. So is there a way so let's reinvent the wheel a bit. Let's look at it differently. Is it possible that we can look at it with the advent of DocuSign? Can we still maintain the oath, but make sure that is something that people have to sign as a way of affirming they're going to be compliant with it?
Quite frankly, I don't think there's any reason you couldn't DocuSign it today. I mean, because the reality is, unlike you who had to stand up and read the oath out loud, most city employees get a piece of paper, they fill in their name, and that they sign that they've read the oath, and then it becomes a portion of their file.
So for most people, they're not being sworn in, there's not an actual
I mean, for
stand up in front of
council
HR and
members,
say-
mayors, members on boards and commissions, those people are, you're formally making the oath outside. I think from the view of the discussions that I've had with the Human Resources Department, they view it as kind of an antiquated thing and that added a little bit more administrative burden. But appreciate the fact that I think they are also committed to continuing to do it if that's the whim or the will of the convention. So,
McPherson again, and I think I've used up all of my statements in this first exchange here, but is there a way, as we think about this, to ponder its value and to, again, rethink its use? I'm as serious about what I undertake as any mayor or any other city official, and I just think there's value to it. And the other part of it is, as a lawyer, you, not me, as a lawyer, does it protect us in any respect that somebody has? You can't confirm that they read it, but you can confirm that they signed it. Is it a way of also protecting ourselves?
certainly, and there are some statutes that do require you to take an oath, whether it protects it, I mean, it certainly puts people on notice. I suppose occasionally it's been used as a exhibit when an employee did something inappropriately to remind people that they swore or affirmed that they were going to conduct themselves in a certain way. Again, I mean, this is purely an administrative thing and not necessarily a value judgment. I may not disagree with the sentiment of many members of the board who understand its importance personally, but again.
This is Angie Quinn, and just, in our business, I wouldn't call it an oath, but we certainly had a mission statement that every employee signed that helped build culture. And a shared understanding. And although this may be antiquated, it impresses upon the fact of the age of the city and the commitment. And to some respects, the culture and the purpose requested, if it's just an extra piece of paper, if it helps one person understand the culture and the commitment, it seems like it's probably a piece of paper of value.
I would agree.
Any other comments from the committee? Comments from the public?
I would just say on this, Kennedy, on dealing with this oath, is the piece of paper should be signed. I mean, if there's a minor change, whatever needs to be, do that for the, that the piece of paper at least be signed by a regular employee. I mean, for the oath, I mean, okay, board members, commissions, council members, mayors, we get that for swearing in, but I think Ms. Quinn's correct. There has to be something there. I think that's good for the employee to at least sign. In this day and age of having an employee file, a lot of things are docu-signed in advance. I don't know how our onboarding works with our HR, but at least there's something there. And I know there's a lot of paperwork that you're required to keep anyway. I don't think it's that burdensome, so.
Other comments? Okay, Mr. Indenbosch, let's go on to the next one.
All
which
right.
is-
Charter Section 5.03.
Yes, sir.
And I'll present what it is. And this may be one that we end up having to consider at another time if you have specific questions of the finance department. Basically, it's a request to allow the city to increase its cash reserve from a maximum of 8% to a maximum of 12%. And I think, at least in some of the discussions I've had with the finance department, the concern is that the 8% is not sufficient in all cases as far as the reserve that they want to keep, particularly as we continue to issue more bonds. Again, I know Mr. Kratz probably dealt with some of this in his past life. This has been a desire of the finance department and the finance director for a number of years. But again, I'll tell you what it is. I can tell you I know why there is, and I probably won't be able to answer in too much detail a ton of your questions as to the specifics as far as the motivation. So I appreciate, I'll try to do the best I can, but if we need to bring this back up and have a member of the finance department here or ask them to prepare something in writing to you justifying why they want it, I'm happy to make that request of them.
Bernard,
I will add that at one time this was a 4% requirement,
Yeah.
and it was moved up to 8. Now they're looking for 12%.
Is the 8% a maximum, and they just want the ability to increase it to 12% if
Correct.
they're able?
8% is a maximum currently.
In fact, at least in the past, when I was with the city, I don't think they even came close to the 8%, but that was always a goal, was to get there.
And how many years ago was the 8% implemented?
Oh,
2 charter conventions ago? I
yeah,
think.
it might have been a charter convention. so
20
good
years
10
ago?
10 years ago.
I think it was 20. I think it might have been 20 years ago because I
Seems
don't
that
think it
long
was the
ago.
last charter convention.
I think we should be encouraging saving wherever we can, so I'm all for that.
Well, don't we also have the dips? I know with school districts, we hit it harder because we get our state aid check, but then we get paid twice a year out of our property taxes. And I know the city gets paid twice a year on the property taxes. I know you get your monthly fees from sales taxes,
Correct.
all that when they're remitted. But how far do you guys go down on the dip? Do you ever have to do fund transfers in order to coverage or have to borrow? Do you guys ever hit your borrow line or?
I'm not aware of us ever having to borrow.
Yeah, this is Paul Kratz. No, we haven't had to borrow to keep up
Cash
to
flow.
operational expenses.
There's one other thing that occurs in our budgeting process, and that is, for example, if there's a surplus for 2022, the way the charter is written, you can't spend that in 2023. It gets carried over to 2024, and that sometimes also provides a little bit of a buffer.
Well, I'll tell you this, someone that serves on another public entity, I think having a prudent cash reserve is important, especially as we're relying more on sales taxes. If those dip in any way, and as we saw from the pandemic, when that hits, the city has to make some pretty hard budget cuts. I mean, we felt that in the library. I think people saw when we let our part-timers go, and we shut down operations for multiple reasons, including health safety, but also too, there was a savings to the city, and I think at one time, wasn't the city down 40 million, 50 million until the money came back?
At one point, we were there, but we also had enough cash flow, so to say.
Correct.
That we could cover that and never had to actually go out and borrow money for short-term operations.
Yeah, but I mean, they have the ability to get up to 12%, but I trust the council and the mayor when they do their budgeting process. You know, they speak for the people. If they want to put it up to 12% for a legitimate reason, I think we should give them that ability.
Other comments? Real quick.
Janet Bonnet, I think we need to think about the future because since what we're doing happens only once every 10 years, we do need to have a sufficient cash fund available. When the trees falling all over the city in August and July of this year hit, there were a lot of people suffering for many days who would not have needed to suffer had that cash fund been utilized to remove those trees more quickly from electric power lines and so forth, yards, streets, offices, homes. I think we need to start thinking about, this isn't a normal decade that's coming up on us. There are going to be some large consequences to things that have been done both politically and environmentally, and we need to think about that. I believe pushing this up to the 12% point, knowing that that money will be recycled if it's not used. It's not going to be a use it or lose it approach. So, but my question is, my suggestion in that case is to go ahead and vote it in. But the question I have is when you say 12%, is it you have the budget and you take 12% of that away, or you have the budget and you calculate the 12% and have that separately?
So the way the charter is written, you have a general appropriation budget. As part of the budgeting process, you could have a cash reserve of up to, now it's currently 8% of whatever the general appropriations are. This would increase that to 12. So if the budget is, the general appropriations 200 million, currently you could have 16 million. Under the change, it'd be 24 million. So it's tied to the appropriations in the budget.
So
And
it's
that
not,
is part of the budget, by the way.
It is.
it is,
It shows up in the budget as an item.
okay, so it's not like you have the budget, the 200 million, and then you add an additional.
No.
It's factored into the actual budget number. Okay,
Correct.
thank you.
Tim Pendrell. Tim Pendrell. When I was reading through the charter before I got the city suggestions, and I saw that the 8% reserves, it terrified me because working, with the appropriations committee and legislature, we left this last session with $1 billion in the rainy day fund. State's budget's around $5 billion. That's because we 100% know what's coming, and we've seen special sessions. The state has not recovered from the special sessions in the early 2000s. So 12% at a minimum for a maximum is just extremely safe the way we fund government in the state of Nebraska. It's gonna hit, and it's gonna hit soon, and it'd be much better to have that cash on hand instead of gutting public service. So that's, like, of everything we've seen, this is like a no-brainer. Be as prepared as possible. So I was really glad to see this recommendation from the staff.
Mr. Pistol?
I know that you're not a part of the finance department, Bernard, so if you can't answer this, that's fine. Maybe someone else on the committee could jump in. But I'm just curious on the tactical ramifications of, I'm assuming that we would see, funds increasingly moved over into the cash reserve to get it to that 12%. Would that mean less investment or budget cuts to the existing budgets, or how would that be managed over time?
Well, I mean, that's mainly probably the administration's viewpoint as opposed to finance. But the reality is, the elected officials, the mayor and the city council, they're going to have to justify to the extent that they either limited increase or cut any particular expenditure that they make. This becomes part of the budgeting process. I wouldn't anticipate that you're going to see direct cuts in one place in order to be able to put it money into the cash reserve. There are I also think it'd be very unlikely that you would see an increase in the tax levy in order to build up the cash reserve, just because of the political implications of something like that. So I would not anticipate that. I think, there are certainly times, if I wanted to be cynical, I could say maybe what it might do is it might delay a small decrease in the levy so that you can keep the cash reserve a little bit higher, so to speak, in the event that you need it for something else. But realistically, that's probably the minimum, the most you would see, because the practical part is there's not a lot of fluff to cut particular things, and if you happen to cut anything, you're going to have to justify that to a number of different people.
Bernard, there's a second part of that, because in Millard, under schools, we have about a 16 to 18% reserve, but that's also too because of when we can only allocate our property taxes twice a year when those funds come in. But the other reason is we have a very high bond rating, and this is, I think, what the mayor was talking about and Steve Curtis is. The city issues a lot of bonds, and when the bond raters look at the city's funds, they look at the potential reserves. I know that helps us on interest.
Absolutely.
And with in an increasing interest rate structure right now that's going on here, anything we can do to lower a quarter or half a point would save a lot more money down the road than the money spent on the percentage. So I think that's the second consideration.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right. And obviously, we've had some discussion of some different additional bonds that are going to be issued as a result of some ongoing projects. Again, probably justifying a need to do some of those things you've talked about to keep the bond rate down.
Yeah, because we're going to be issuing a series of bonds here soon for the school district based upon that, and that was one of the considerations was our reserve fund. So I think that's prudent to do that.
McPherson, I'm trying not to comment on every single topic because I think in some respects it's piling on. But I think that there's some of these things that we talk about that make sense. And if the folks who deal with the finances, who are actually part of the city staff and departmental staff for the city who have identified this as a need, I think our job is to be a reasonable person, male or female, and to think about the implications. I think the last statement made was where I was gonna go relative to inflation, some of the other funding and financing that we'll need to do. And this is not a normal year. We have no idea what next year is going to look like. So bring on the comments, but I think it makes sense.
I will add that Bernard mentioned when there's a surplus, it flips over for a year to the next year. A lot of times, some of that surplus will be put into the cash reserve. So there's always some money going into that, trying to build it up. Other comments? Comments from the public? Next one.
And if it's all right, I'm going to address the next two together because they are sort of related and they deal with purchasing. And I would tell you that this is, I indicated there were two departments that requested this. I could have probably put four. This is the most oft requested charter amendment by city employees and staff, and they have to do with both 516 and 517, dealing with the purchasing procedure. Currently, under 516, anytime the city makes a purchase in the amount of $20,000 or more, it's obligated to go out for formal sealed competitive bids. Many of the other entities that we deal with, particularly Douglas County, their limit is $50,000 is the amount that they need to go out for formal sealed competitive bids. The result is, and the $20,000 number that we have here hasn't changed for 40 years. And it was proposed last time in the Charter Convention and the time before, with the request being that the obligation to have formal sealed bid be raised from $20,000 to $50,000. There are some other processes in place for bids that are less than $20,000, but it doesn't require the formal sealed bid, which for those of you that are familiar, that is, you got to put together a bid package, you have to publish it, you have to allow bids to come in, you have a formal bid opening, and then you'll have a formal award. And that gets to 5.17, which is the second part and tied to this particular thing. The city charter requires that any contract in the amount of $20,000 in any year be approved by resolution of the city council. So any purchase, if you were to purchase a single vehicle that was $21,000, it's required that it come to the city council for approval. There's another provision which we're not talking about changing, which is if you're committing money for multiple years, it still requires city council action. That would not be changed by this. All the request is that we change the $20,000 for requiring formal sealed bids and requiring city council approval to $50,000 to kind of keep up with the times, as this hasn't been changed for a significant period of time, and also, frankly, to maybe keep up with some of the other governmental entities that we have seen these types of increases, and in particular Douglas County, which is the entity with which we have a merged purchasing function. They do have a $50,000 limit as well. So anyway, that's, as I said, this is the most oft requested charter amendment within this particular building, and it comes up quite frequently. So,
Kouth, with the Douglas County purchasing being at 50,000, have they, when they increased theirs from 20,000 to 50,000, have they seen any problems? Have there been any complaints? Has there been any ramifications that would be viewed negatively when they did that?
I'm not aware of any. I mean, of course, I'm not affiliated with Douglas County Purchasing. I'm looking at Ryan, who represents our purchasing function. I don't think he's aware of any issues. Obviously, the biggest change that it is it does provide more discretion to departments to be able to make purchases without having to go through the city council process or the formal bidding process. As I said, there's still some requirements as far as going out and getting multiple offers before you can make a purchase. That wouldn't change, but it's just a matter of requiring the formal sealed bids and or the city council action. And I will add one other thing just so people remember. If this charter convention were to recommend those changes, it doesn't end up being on the ballot until the city council adopts an ordinance also authorizing it. So the city council would also have to be on board before this issue would ever make it to the public for consideration.
Any comments from the public?
Angie Quinn, I just have a comment. I mean, you look at the time value of money, and 40 years ago, 20,000, in today's money is like 150,000.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting to move it to 150,000, but it makes the request of 50,000 seem more than reasonable. So I mean, I would be in favor of that.
McPherson, once again, anybody who's been to the grocery store knows that the cost of a loaf of bread has gone up. If you try to buy anything at the meat counter, it's not going up, it's way up. So $50,000 seems reasonable. We can keep talking about it, but it seems reasonable.
Yes, sir.
Tim Pendrell, with the...
Would you turn on your mic, please?
There we go. Tim Pendrell, with the competitive sealed bid and kind of how archaic and cumbersome that is, completely open to making that more efficient and lowering those numbers. With just the 50,000 versus 20,000 procurement rule, the state's at 50,000, the state's a dumpster fire. This is a protecting taxpayer money issue. Making it efficient, making it cleaner, absolutely. State of Iowa is 25,000. Anything over 25,000 for any government agency at any level in the state of Iowa is $25,000, with the exception if it's for targeted small businesses, and they have a whole system in place to do that. So there's a community goal on the other end of it. We don't do that in Nebraska. There's a couple entities that you can look at, State Board of Education, and you look at what they vote in acclamation, which is a more public one than the state process. You will see a lot of $49,000 contracts, just hands down.
Yep.
And you will recognize the names on those $49,000 contracts. And then those contracts will be amended. They will bypass procurement. They do it in state routinely. We don't have any recourses in the state of Nebraska, whereas other states do. State of Iowa, again, any government employee, including school districts, school boards, community college, that violate their Iowa businesses, small businesses, targeted small business, it's a criminal violation. It's not a civil case, it's criminal. It's a misdemeanor for every occurrence. That's my problem with it. Now I think our bidding is archaic, and the sealed bid in an envelope is dumb.
Well-
But the idea to make it easier for government to write $49,000 checks with limited public oversight, it's not working well for the state. It's cost Nebraska taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars, and there's a special investigation committee to change all that and come up with new procurement law for the state. Now, specifically with the sealed bids, not really the same issue. That is stupid. But with the purposes of protecting taxpayer dollars, protecting local businesses, local contractors, we started this off by saying we want more inclusion and more diversity. Quarterly, an agency in the state of Iowa is required to send all their purchasing requirements to their economic development department to ensure that small businesses under $4 million in revenue are getting the opportunities to bid. A school district is required to spend 10% of their revenue on that. We do not have good procurement law in the model, so looking at other government agencies in the state of Nebraska is not a good model. Looking anywhere else in the country is much better.
Well,
But I'd be fine with rewriting the whole thing.
Well,
And making it more efficient and easier to access for businesses.
Sure.
And having worked in government accounting, for just accounting staff in general.
And I think you reflect a lot of some of the problems we've had in the past with our bidding procedures here at the city of Omaha. And totally rewriting them would probably be a pretty good idea at some point.
Well, and that's one thing I wanted to add, and there's actually another 5.16 on the agenda for later in the item, and that doesn't necessarily have any proposed changes, but the city and the county are in the process of implementing electronic bidding. That is, hopefully, dispenses with some of the archaic things that have occurred, allows it more fluid, hopefully makes it easier, less cumbersome, less steps. One of the questions, and we may have to look at this, is if, depending on kind of the inclination of the convention, is whether there are some revisions we can propose to 5.16 to make it clear that that's the direction that we want to go. Secondly, I understand we certainly have contracts that go into effect for $19,900 because there's a $20,000 limit. The one thing I will say, there has been the advice that our department has provided is if I do $19,900 and I do a change order, and I do another contract for a similar amount to the same vendor, that's violating the provision of the charter because of doing it. We also have a code section that requires going back to the council if you make amendments in certain time. Now, I appreciate the code does not have the same gravitas as the charter because the code can obviously be changed by the city council, though I would submit to you that they're unlikely to do anything that would give them less oversight as opposed to more. And then you did express a little bit of concern about SEB and some of those things, and I know, and you may be familiar with some of the stuff that the programs the city has. We do have an SCB, Small and Economic Disadvantaged Business Program, as well as a Economic Inclusion Program that are part of our code. Again, not part of the charter, but part of the code, so they could theoretically they could be amended by the council without a vote of the people. But again, those things are fairly well established. They're not requirements. They're obviously, but certainly the intention of those is to provide opportunity for smaller businesses, emerging businesses, and like. So there are some of those things that provide some of the protections that you're concerned about, but I appreciate your point. So.
Other comments?
McPherson, so is it within our authority to not just take the recommendation as given, but to to the points, some of the points that have been made, that we can actually reshape? And, I mean, do we have that authority?
Absolutely you do.
Okay,
I
the
mean,
answer is yes.
The
We
reality
can do
is,
that.
is any amendment of the charter that this body feels is appropriate, whether it's suggested by somebody else or whether it comes out of one of your committees or it's an idea, a brainchild that one of you has after hearing some of this, and as long as it's the consensus of the convention as a whole, that's what you want to do, and that's the recommendation that you make to the city council, that it goes to them for consideration. So you're right that we can be more, if there's other things that you want to address, and that may be something
Yes.
that you consider in one of the subcommittees about, where you have a smaller group where maybe you can focus on rewriting some of those stuff, or if somebody has some ideas or thoughts, certainly you can reach out to me. I don't mind talking and helping maybe draft something for you that you can bring back for the whole convention to consider.
Mr. Crystal?
So I have two quick questions to Angie's point on time value money from a different perspective. If you could provide some ballpark estimates on what the time difference is in terms of employee or departmental time on a bid that's over this requirement versus one that's under, and then any rough numbers on how many bids fall between 50 and 20. And I know you're not in finance, so once again, if you can't answer those, but
Yeah,
just
I
to
don't
try
know
to-
that I can give you a range of how many contracts fall under 20, between 20 and 50 and above. I can certainly ask the finance department to run a report and they would have to look at payments made to contractors as opposed to having necessarily the contracts all in one place. That being said, as far as the time difference, it's going through the competitive bidding process. Probably best case scenario is a 5 to 6 week process, probably more often longer than that, because you've got to compile the specifications, you've got to put it out for bid, you've got to allow bids to come in, and then once the bids come in, you have to send them to the city council for consideration. It's probably more like an 8-week to 12-week process. Whereas if you don't have to do that, the process can probably be as quick as a week. So, it is far more expedient to do it. That's good and bad as the things that you've pointed out. And there's no question that, there's probably some cases where something might come in and be bid at 21,000. We're going to them and saying, look, we'll enter into a contract for 19,500. If you stay under 20, you might get a little bit of a better deal. Some of the same things might happen if it was 50,000, but I also appreciate some of the concern about amendments and whatever else that sometimes do occur.
In terms of during that 8 to 12 weeks versus 1 week, is that, maybe 30 hours, 40 hours full-time for a staff member to undertake that process versus maybe an hour or two, it sounds like, for the
Well,
more
the
informal?
reality is, because most bid specifications aren't unique, so you're able to take something that you've had before, modify it, and use it. It might be 5 to 10 hours of staff time through that whole 8 to 12 week process as opposed to 30. I mean, I'm sure I can find some instances where it's more than that, but the reality is probably most contracts would fit in that shorter 5 to 10 hours of staff time.
Other comments from the committee?
I got a comment. Salgado here. So, Mr. Pendrell, that was a great suggestion. I'm very familiar with the SEB program. It's probably one of the programs that I least like from the city. The process is very antiquated. To be honest, I don't even know how any of the minority or small businesses get any opportunity. They're on the list. Every time I ask how many of those businesses were selected, I can never get an answer. So whoever's on the committee, finance committee or whatever, that could add, given the SEB program, an opportunity to bid on these, even if it's at 50,000, whatever it may be, it should definitely have a first right to that program to suggest. So I would heavily lean that way. Thank you for bringing that up.
I would suggest you might contact Human Rights and Relations. They should have those statistics.
I already have a couple times.
Okay. They should have them. Other comments? Yes, sir.
Tim Pendrell,
And you could draft us to help you get an answer if you're not able to get one. I mean, we should be, some of that information should be public. or
Tim
is public.
Pendrell, just to kind of follow up on that. I think it's seeing what we can do within our authority to do it right and really make sure it's an advantage, but also make it more efficient, more accessible, and not to make a change like this just because it's more convenient, but because we might be able to make it more convenient and more efficient and work better. But yeah, I think we should always have community outcomes on the top of our minds as much as convenience and efficiency. Work in state accounting and working, yeah, it's like going to a hotel when you have GSA rates. It's always the same price. That does exist, and that's fine. And there are absolutely things that are just way more efficient to get it done quickly, where it shouldn't necessarily need the city council and all that. But when we're talking about, building a workforce, building an economy, if we could kind of marry those two principles and maybe increase it to $50,000, but also kind of increase the transparency and the access for a whole bunch of businesses, that $49,500 contracts would absolutely change their company, as opposed to turning 5 weeks into 15 minutes. And that's the only kind of thing that when I looked at this, I didn't like, because we've just seen a number of no-bid contracts going out. Purchasing knows what they can do and what they can't do, and that's also an opportunity to do things better. So I would absolutely be on board for working this and working with city staff to see what we can do just to make this all work a little bit better, and let's go up to 100,000. If the protections are in place and the rationale is there, that's not so much my concern. It's that doing it for convenience, kind of like when we were talking earlier. I don't know the retentions on oaths, and how long you have to keep those records, and what warehouse in the building, there's binders and binders of oaths from 50-year employees. But convenience should not be the primary motivation for us.
McPherson, amen.
Kennedy, I'm trying to be brief on this, but I think I see a concurrent theme developing that what this committee has, and we get done in mid-June, or July, excuse me, which is, 5-6 weeks away. Yep. Here are my two concerns. One is, I see what some of this committee does, at least from my perspective, is to clean up what the mayor, the city departments, the city council, and then input from the public to do something. The second part of it is our limited capacity. Even though we've been appointed by the mayor and city council members, we are representatives of the public through them. We're not going to have all the information and knowledge to do that. I also know this, is that the city council and the mayor at any time can work on city charter amendments, but I think there should probably be two baskets we put these in. One is the things that this board will eventually vote on, that we agree is a majority, and hopefully more than that on each subject, that, hey, this is something the city needs to do now. But I think also, too, is I think the council and the mayor need maybe a written document from us that's compiled of our ideas, the conversations. For example, Armando, you had a very good statement about the state of those contracts and how they're put out. And also, Tim, you did well on that part, too. Even though we don't have the time and the resources, I think we can make a recommendation to the council and the mayor. These are things that this council and the mayor should work together on to fix with their expertise and time, because these are concerns from the community. Because I think that's really important, because we're not going to be able to address all of them, but there are some things from our different vantage points that we would like the city to work on over the next couple of years to get those accomplished, because I think it's really important to have these contracts restructured. And yeah, Angie's right here. The value of money's gone up, and we haven't kept tab with the times, but also, too, Tim point out says some people haven't done well by the system and do $19,000 contracts or $49,000 contracts. So to sum it up, is if this board's inclined to do that, I think we should have a document that says, hey, this is what we've agreed on that's forwarded to the council for vote. And two, these are things that the mayor and the council should work together on going forward to address these items that the community felt should be addressed. So that's all I have.
And I think we can present whatever we want to present, frankly. We have that flexibility.
Yep, you do.
Next one?
All right. 5.2, disposal of real property. Currently, any property that the city, real property that the city has that it disposes of, it's obligated by charter to put in the advance acquisition fund. The city does have some separate enterprise funds. Those are self-sustaining funds that do not require any generally property tax income. They're derived by income that's raised. The parking fund is probably the primary one that most of us know. There's a parking enterprise fund. It receives all the parking meter money, all the money from the parking garages. It's what's used to maintain the parking garages and what will be used to help purchase new parking garages and help finance new parking garages. The concern that the finance department has is when you have some property that may be sold or disposed of through the property process that was purchased entirely using funds from the enterprise fund, by charter it's required currently to go to the advance acquisition fund, which is a fund separate and apart from the enterprise fund. The idea of this particular amendment be, hey, if the real property was purchased with money from the enterprise fund and it's sold, the funds from that particular sale should go back into the enterprise fund from whence they came. So,
Comments? If not, I've
Cap,
got... Go
I
ahead.
have a question. So to clarify, so when you have real property, it's sold and it goes into a general fund, but not back to the
it goes
group that
into
bought it?
a special fund called the Advance Acquisition Fund, which only can be used to purchase other property. That's a portion of part of the general fund.
So if the parking fund buys something and then it's no longer needed, they sell it, they don't get to keep that money?
Correct.
Okay.
And this particular amendment is intended to require that and we're talking real property, would go back in that fund.
Actually, my comment kind of goes back to, he who has the gold controls, and if you have an enterprise fund that continually collects money as they sell property, they can kind of become a little fiefdom on their own. Plus, it reduces the flexibility of the mayor taking funds that maybe sell a library, for example, and you want to use those funds to purchase another piece of property. It reduces that flexibility from the mayor's standpoint. So those are my comments, my thoughts on it.
I got a question, Salgado. So those funds are, I guess, how does that benefit the public other than buying other properties? Is it just real property is the only thing that could be purchased? It can't be used for anything else?
It has to be used for real property.
If it's in the Advance Acquisition Fund, it has to be
Yeah,
used for real
right,
property.
yes.
With this particular amendment, the sale, the funds from the proceeds of the sale of the property would go back into the enterprise fund, and they would not necessarily be restricted to purchasing new real property.
Which I think is the intent of this.
Yeah, ultimately, the reality is they probably will, but the way it's written currently doesn't require that.
Tim Pendrell, so the state currently has over 800 fiefdoms, also called cash accounts, that collect their interest and hold it, and it's not appropriated by the legislature. It is a dangerous road. But to earmark it all into one fund, I can't wait to look up the balance on that tonight.
It's not that big, believe me or not.
Well,
It's
Well, we don't sell property a lot.
And please appreciate that any money, any expenditures out of the parking enterprise fund still have to be approved by the city
Yeah.
council.
And the parking enterprise one. That
Or
was
any of
one,
our
just
enterprise
the-
funds. Any of
yeah.
the city's enterprise funds still are subject to the contract requirements
Yeah.
in 5.17.
Yeah, it's just to throw out kind of something to think about. City of Lincoln's charter has behavioral health endowment from the sale of their old hospital in their charter, and that's how they fund their mental health needs in the city of Lincoln. Fiefdoms I agree with, but within state law, there have been opportunities like that where they have earmarked certain sales for specific uses. That's how we fund children's health care in Nebraska is the healthcare cash fund on I believe the tobacco settlement. So putting it in the originating enterprise fund is a way to skirt city council, mayor's office, just to use how the state operates as an allegory, not as familiar, the inner workings of the city. But yeah, I can send you a list of the 800.
I'm amazed.
Yeah, over 800 cash accounts that collect interest every month. And if you read any state audit, most agencies aren't even necessarily aware they have them. So.
Any other comments? Any comments from the public? Okay, let's move on.
All right, well, hopefully the next couple will be a little bit easier. The next one is disposal of real personal property, 5.21. And basically, the requested amendment is to remove references of the purchasing division and purchasing agent and replace them with finance department. In 2007, the city entered into an interlocal agreement with Douglas County for purposes of providing our purchasing functions. We have not had a purchasing division or a purchasing agent since that period of time. A lot of the charter section that referred to the purchasing division when it was first done was actually removed previously. This particular request is to basically, and the purchasing division was under the direction of the finance director. So this would replace the purchasing agent and the purchasing division with the finance department and the finance director.
I might add, this is one situation where years ago, the city and the county merged the purchasing division as the public wanted, and now we're probably to the point where it's kind of where it is at, and we should get rid of some of the old language. Comments? Any comments from the public? Next one.
All right, the next one's another one that is more of a cleanup type thing. So the charter as it currently is written, we used to not actually have a city treasurer. We used to rely on the county treasurer. We used to have language that referenced that the county treasurer was to act as the city treasurer. That all changed as a result of some changes in state legislation 10, 12 years ago, and there were some changes made in the city charter in the past to make those changes. What this particular change would do, currently there is a city treasurer. That city treasurer is a competitively selected person, goes through a competitive process. The way the charter is currently written seems to indicate that the finance director would designate any individual within the finance department to serve as the city treasurer. This attempts to make clear that the city treasurer will be appointed through a classified process, which requires it's an open competitive testing process, typically with a structured interview and grading, and then a selection process. Obviously, the person would still report to the finance director.
Comments from the committee?
So what are you recommending it be changed to?
As it's written in there, a city treasurer shall be a classified position appointed through the competitive testing process.
My question is, appointed by who?
It's appointed, the city treasurer reports to the finance director, so it would be appointed by the finance director.
Okay.
And obviously, the finance director ultimately is an unclassified position who reports to the mayor.
Comments from the public? Okay, let's move on.
This is
I'm sorry.
Quinn. Just on 5.23, if that's the way it goes, there is a typo in that sentence.
Okay. Shall be, yep. I found
Good
some,
pickup.
there were some others too before, so I will fix that. All right. The next one is section 3.12. This is a request by the Public Works Department. Again, I would say this is cleanup in nature. It adds the phrase stormwater management to the list of functions that the Public Works Department performs. That's obviously a function that they perform. They view it as a distinct function from sewers and sewage treatment. So they've asked that that be included.
Comments? I might add the way I understand stormwater management is something different, obviously, than sewers.
Absolutely.
It's more controlling the water as it comes, the rain as it comes down, and how it flows off parking lots, how it flows off the land.
Yep.
How much hard surfaces you have versus surfaces that can be penetrated. So it's a pretty broad process. Yeah. Anyway, that's my comment. Any other comments?
Stormwater management is absolutely essential for an urban area because we tend to think it's okay to pave just about anything because then we don't have to mow it. But we need water in our soils and we need to control the runoff. We need green spaces, so it kind of dominoes across the environmental spectrum of how we control water in our city. And right now with the sewer separation, there's very little sewage in our stormwater runoff. So it needs to be taken care of so we can take care of our rivers. It's an extremely important element. Thank you for bringing that up, Mr. Kratz.
I will say Public Works has been doing this function for some time, so it's like Bernard said, it's kind of a cleanup issue. Any comments? Comments from the public? Okay, next one, Bernard.
The next section is also one I've kind of addressed before, and that's a request by the Public Works Department that the section 5.16, which is the purchasing procedure, we already discussed that in the context of the $20,000 versus $50,000 bidding requirement, that it be amended to make it explicit that the city can do electronic bidding. There isn't any suggested language in the document that's provided. If that's something that the Charter Convention is inclined to do, and maybe part of a review of the entire section like we've talked about, I'm happy to work with one of the three of us. Will be happy to work with you in putting together some language. So in any event, I don't think there's probably any philosophical objection to electronic bidding. We hope that does occur, and it should speed up maybe my 8 to 12 weeks and make it a little bit faster, a little bit more efficient, less time consuming on staff, and hopefully, most importantly, simpler for people who want to submit bids.
So I take it the intent is to eliminate publicizing in newspapers.
I don't know. I don't think that's the intent of the purchasing procedure section. The intention, I know you're probably looking at 8-11.
I'm sorry, I'm ahead of you.
Yep. But obviously, when it comes to purchasing, it wouldn't change the publication requirements. It's just electronic bidding. But if there aren't any, I'll be happy to move on to 8-11 when you're.
Let me ask any comments.
Since you're ready, we're already asking me.
Janet Bonnet, I have a comment. If we do e-bidding, which makes perfect sense to me in an electronic world, will the information then be more readily available to the public? Because in a closed bid and the system that we have now, the archaic system we're using now, it's pretty shady. I mean, as far, not illegal shading, I'm sorry. It's not completely illuminated about how it works and how the communities are impacted by the bidding cycles and how they're carried out. So will e-bidding make it easier to keep track of who's bidding, what type of communities are being assisted by it, what kind of small businesses are being attracted and able to utilize it, and so forth? Can we keep better records?
Well, first of all, I mean, any RFP that's issued by the city is available online to any member of the public, whether it's issued by the city or the county. Any bid that's accepted in an amount of $20,000 or more is approved by the city council and does appear on the city council agenda. Any contract less than that is available through, any contract where the city is a party, with the exception of some very limited ones, are available to public records requests. But the e-bidding, the electronic bidding process, I don't think is necessarily fundamentally done towards what you're talking about, which is how do I do record searches afterwards? But the reality is there are probably portals that allow you to do that after it's engaged. I mean, the e-bidding platform is really about what we're focusing on is really that first part, which is making bids available to people. People can look at them, people can prepare them and do it, complete them in a way that's easier and cheaper, be able to submit them, be able to do bid bonds and those bid requirements easier, which should make it easier for the small, the disadvantaged businesses to be able to submit bids, hopefully, because right now it's hard. You have to go get a bid bond from a surety. If you're an experienced company, that's an easier thing to do than if you're somebody just starting out. And some of these things will be helped. I imagine there will be portals. I don't know. That's certainly something that it's been raised. It's certainly something I know Ms. Butler's been involved in a lot of the discussion about e-bidding, as has Mr. Weiss. And the concerns that you've expressed are something that they've now heard, and obviously, that's something that maybe can be addressed. I don't know that that's the real origin of the reason to switch, but it potentially could be a benefit of it.
Sotolongo, I want to mirror a little bit of what Janet mentioned. I think she's also talking about accessibility for the bid process itself, and I don't know if the city charter has any sort of language or takes into consideration a commitment to accessibility so that, like Mr. Pendrell said, we don't see the same vendors over and over again on these lists, so that the information is available to any small business that wants to apply for that bid process. I guess I just not sure if there's anything that we can do in the city charter that's sort of it's sort of a commitment to accessibility. Just something I thought we could consider.
Well, you can certainly consider language. I mean, how it would be implemented might be, worthy of some discussion.
And maybe to your question is, should some of those issues be more of an ordinance as opposed to a charter?
Yeah.
Maybe you have the general idea from a charter standpoint, and then the city can create ordinances that make things more accessible.
Because the charter lays out the broad parameters. Chapter 10 of the municipal code has entire sections that address the process for bidding, what's available, and changes that were made. And I have the SEB program, the EIP program, and I appreciate some of the concerns that have been expressed by others about some of those things. But obviously, the council has the ability to amend those things and put in new processes. We've recently, last year, put in some processes to try and encourage companies to bring in younger people and other people in through the businesses by putting some credits into the city code. But there's certainly an ability to do that. I mean, you could put a pronouncement, but ultimately, I think Mr. Kratz is correct that a lot of those things are already available as tools to the city council, and if there's things that you have particular interest in, I can certainly pass those along to the council, but you obviously can also talk to individual council members yourself. I mean, there's nothing that would restrict you from doing it, and maybe part of the charter convention process is it engages you in things that you now prioritize and may want to get more involved with council members.
Well, I think it goes back to that document that said these are concerns that have been raised by the board, and then we should document those and list those out line by line item. That would be helpful as a direction to the council and mayor.
I want to follow the same line, Salgado here. So it says it is in the charter, right? It's written right in front of me. So I think it's official newspaper. What official newspaper is there? What does the city use? And I can tell you in certain
you
areas.
go to section 8 dash.
He's ahead too. just
No,
like
no,
me.
he's referencing 5-16, but 8-11 in my memo actually is also the current version of the charter. So the charter allows the city to designate each year the official newspaper.
What's the current official newspaper?
It's the Daily Record.
Okay. So there's some certain communities small businesses that will never see that. They probably have the capabilities to bid or be a part of the process, but will never see that. So yeah, it's very disproportionate as far as how the communication goes throughout to certain areas of the city.
And now you're jumping ahead, and I'll go ahead and address
I am,
8
sorry.
No, you're fine. I'm going to address 8-11
Yeah, I
because
did too, so.
that's a request from the city clerk to allow for publication by some means other than a newspaper.
Thank you.
And I assume that means online or whatever else. And I think there isn't any specific language that's proposed there, but I think if there are, I know that's an interest of the city clerk, and she can address it if she has any more concerns. But I do think you're right. I mean, obviously, the relevance of newspapers in our daily life has certainly changed in the last 10 to 20 years. And the access and, for people to access newspapers has certainly changed as well. And obviously, we've had this wonderful thing called the internet, which is increasingly available to more and more people as available. So that is 8-11, which is the next item that was on your amendment, which was proposed by the city clerk, was a request to consider allowing for publication by some other than newspaper. And it may mean, not that she wants another thing that she has to do, but it may mean that you require multiple forms of publication.
Kauth, you have a list of all of the business licenses in the city, correct? Is there a way to send out an email to all of them when you have bidding processes, or do you have any way to contact those people?
There are, I don't believe we don't have a business license for every type of license. We certainly have certain types of occupation taxes that require certain types of businesses to register, and we might have a list of restaurants, for example, because of the restaurant tax. But we don't have, there's no requirement that every business of every type register within the city. I mean, typically when talking about bidding, in addition to publishing the bids in the newspaper, the purchasing division will send out the specifications to any entity that has previously bid on that or a related bid. But again, I appreciate the point there is that necessarily available to everybody? And I think that's the point that Mr. Salgado is attempting to make.
Let me ask a question here on the request for proposals and bids. Is every one of those published somewhere online on a city website, or does that only go out to a list of people that approach the city and say, I want to be on that list?
Every bid for competitive bid is listed i.e. that means it's anticipated that the contract will be in excess of $20,000, is available on the city county purchasing website.
Perfect.
Every RFP, most RFPs, and it used to be I would have said every RFP, but I can come up with a couple instances recently where the RFP process was not necessarily through the purchasing division, but in those instances they've been available on other places on the city website. Every bid, almost every RFP.
And what RFPs would be excluded, do you know?
Well, there's been a couple RFPs that have been issued recently. One relative to the library, which was available in the public, but I don't think that was placed on the purchasing website. It was done through the planning department.
Was it on their website?
It was on the planning department website, but it wasn't consolidated in the same place that necessarily every other purchasing RFP would have been. And I thought that's what you were asking. So
Perfect. No, because I'm familiar with that, even though we didn't handle it. City handled the RFP, not the library itself. But yeah, I think that's kind of the big concern here that I'm hearing from a lot of people is that's one of those oughts, is making sure that the community has a way to know about those bidding opportunities, especially on the disadvantaged and the minority contracts. So,
McPherson, I had in my notes, because I made notes throughout that this is an opportunity to increase access and to include online technology and even instances where social media could be engaged. So I think that we should move from, I won't insult anybody, I'll just say we should move from the dark ages and we should increase the opportunity to engage people so all folks can have access.
Janet Bonnet here. I want to say that I've seen in the last year or 18 months huge difference in the amount of connectivity that through the mayor's office, through the communications officers, that there's more information out there for community folks to get a hold of and be able to forward on to other people. So instead of saying publication by some other means, make it publication in addition to the newspaper. But I think electronic communication through websites and even putting a list up. If you want to be on the list, get on the list. It's easier to do it on a website than it is to perhaps send in a letter, get it into a secretary, have it entered into a new database. It will really improve the connectivity if we do use other options. So I appreciate that. And again, I want to give kudos to Carrie Murphy and her team for getting out the great websites and Parks Department, planning, and others. Really good job. And if there's somebody that I should be saying thank you to, please hear this as a thank you to you too.
McPherson, amen.
Other comments on this one from the public? Okay, let's move on.
All right. The next request is on section 2.02, and I think you might have heard this last week as well, and you'll see it in item 5A as well, and that is to change the qualifications for council members from 1 year in their district to 6 months, and you'll see the same change requested by the election commissioner, and as is cited in the request by election commissioner, that is intended to be consistent with the Nebraska statute, section 32-501, which has a 6-month time period for council members and the mayor.
Any additional comments from last week? We did discuss this last week, so. Comments from, go, I'm sorry.
Janet Bonnet, this is a pet peeve of mine. I really think this 6 months is way too short for anybody to live somewhere and pretend that they would know how to lead us. But my question is, if there's a difference between compliance and conforming to something, at least in the legal translations that I do. My question is, what penalties would the city of Omaha suffer if we pushed for increasing that time frame to a year for city council and 2 or 3 years for the mayor? I realize that it's a state law, and state law has superiority. Federal law is supposed to be over the states too, but we've seen a lot of that crumbling recently. I really want to know if there's a method for the city of Omaha to regain power through its home charter, home rule charter, to increase those for the city offices, at least, the city elective offices.
So the answer to your question is there is no penalty, because the reality is the state law preempts the city charter and the city code. So whether we keep it at 1 year or whether we change it to 12 years, the state statute says it's 6 months, and until you can convince the people in Lincoln to change it, it's going to be whatever there is. So there isn't a penalty. It's just the reality. What's the rule? And the rule is going to be, you know, in areas where they preempt us, their rule carries over ours.
And I might add, it's likely we would be sued by the ACLU, and they would probably
If we
win the
tried to
case.
enforce it.
Yeah.
But the reality is, the advice from the city law department would likely be, hey, the state statute preempts the city charter, and notwithstanding that the city charter was amended, we're going to follow.
Quick, Plucker comment. Last week, Mr. Pendrell gave the suggestion that, because it very well might get changed in Lincoln. If enough people feel like 6 months is too short, I can see a very long, drawn-out public hearing where we get that change. So, but I wanted to hear, Mr. Kretz, did you not like the idea of saying, as prescribed by state law? I forgot what your
I'm not sure I said that. Like Bernard said that, frankly, the state law is going to preempt whatever the city does. So if the state law changes to something longer than 6 months, maybe we could put some language in there to correspond with what the state law suggests.
Real quick, that Tim Pendrell, that is how Lincoln's is written. It's basically, they have it in there, and it's like, go look at what the state tells you. But just practical question, with on the ballot, make the recommendations, people are voting on them. On the ballot, they get to vote on each recommendation separately, or are they grouped together?
They'll get to vote on an amendment to each section separately.
Okay.
Be
I just want to make, because I could see something like this tanking the whole thing.
Yeah, no.
Like those bozos at City Hall trying to get away with something.
Each section will be
I was just
separate.
thinking that, like, you put one thing in there, and then all of a sudden it's a poison pill for
Understand.
everything. Yeah, so that's
Also-
what I thought. I just wanted to be
Also,
sure.
as we go through this process, keep in mind, we shouldn't, I suppose, forward all of these onto the city council. Because the ballot will have each individual suggestion, and that can be an awful long ballot and a very expensive ballot. So, anyway, we'll talk about that later.
Yeah,
as we get
and
to
the reality
deciding.
is, I think, the report from the last charter convention indicated, I think there were 20 recommendations for changes by the charter convention, and I think the city council ended up approving, as I recall, 6 or 7, and those actually went on to the ballot. So, I mean, the reality is, you're making a recommendation, which they're going to have. In this particular case, they've got a fairly quick turnaround from when they get your recommendation to the time that they have to get it approved so that it can be on the ballot. But as I know was indicated.
For this year.
For this year.
It could
But
be
as was
other years.
indicated earlier, at any point in time, the city council can request that a charter amendment be put on the ballot. It doesn't just have to be as a result of the charter convention, and they could choose to wait 2 years on the recommendations that this convention made, and somebody may bring forth those requests.
Other comments?
The one comment I would put out there a little bit to what Ms. Plucker had said about reflecting the state language is that we've talked a lot about accessibility and making this clear. And for someone that maybe is interested in the political process and doesn't have access to the other institutions, I know there's a lot of things that would prevent this, but they're to open up the city charter at this point in time, and they've lived in Omaha for 7 months, they might say, oh, I couldn't run for city council, and they wouldn't even go through the process of doing that when legally they do have that right because of the state law. So I do think at the bare minimum, having some language in there reflecting that, even if we believe that that should be changed, it would go in the face of that accessibility that we've also said we want to have.
Ms. Thorpe, I'm aware that happened in this last election, that this was misread and somebody thought that they were not qualified and did not run, and absolutely could have, because they were under the 1 year. They were believing it was 1 year because they read the city charter, they were prepared to run, and somebody told them, well, you have to live there a year, you've moved across the street, you've only lived there 11 months, sorry, you can't run, and later found out. So that has happened, and that has happened in the most recent city elections. So that's
I guess I'd be surprised they wouldn't talk to the
accurate.
city clerk before they file, in any event. That does happen.
It's all the information people want to give people. So,
Or
yeah.
what neighbors say.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. You cannot run. Absolutely.
Okay, the next one,
All
Bernard.
right. The next two fall in the category of requests that were made by the city clerk as a result, obviously, of what we went through a couple years ago. The change to Section 2-10. Currently, the charter requires that the city council meet twice each month at minimum. They're supposed to meet regularly, but no less than twice each month. There were some difficulties, obviously, in the declared emergency when we were in the pandemic, and the language here is kind of a start. We'd obviously need to tweak the language that's we'd obviously need to tweak the language that's in the draft here, but the city clerk suggested that the restriction of meeting a minimum of 2 times a month be waived if they're unable to meet as a result of a declared emergency or pandemic. We'd have to tweak the language a little bit to make it more clear, but there were a couple of times where the city council didn't necessarily have a whole lot of action. We're kind of forced to meet in a time when it may not have been advisable based on where the pandemic was. So again, this is intended to be a limited exception to make clear in rare instances, if certain conditions are met, the requirement to meet a minimum of twice a month would be waived.
And you speaking to both
Well, I'll speak
2.10 and 2.13?
I can speak to 213
Why don't you?
as well. 213 again is another section that was suggested at the city clerk as a result of the pandemic. There is an ability to do emergency ordinance in limited instances, which requires less readings of the city council. You still have to go to the city council. You still have to make your finding, but there's limited instances where it can occur. There were some ordinances that were suggested to try to address issues related to the pandemic that required to go through the full process because they didn't meet one of the exceptions. And again, this is an attempt to allow an exception in the case that the state or the city has declared an emergency to allow emergency ordinances to be adopted. You would still need 6 members of the council or a unanimous vote. It wouldn't change the voting requirements of the super majority that would be needed to adopt an emergency ordinance.
Comments from the committee?
I think in an emergency, you need to be meeting more, or at least keep that consistency with meeting. I think that's the wrong time to take a step back from what's going on. I don't like the idea of not having those meetings happening.
Bonnet, I have a question since we've combined the two of them. Yes, I agree that the council needs to be available to each other and to the public during an emergency in particular. And am I remembering correctly, Mr. Kratz, that you talked about meeting electronically or online or by phone or what, CB radio, I don't know.
That's right. State law allows, I guess, video teleconferencing in certain situations. That does not apply to the city or cities, so we would not be able to do so unless state law is changed.
So state law controls how we connect within our own city in a case of emergency?
The state law connects how open meetings have to be conducted in the state of Nebraska.
And
And
there's
that's what-
been no movement for change since the pandemic and all the new
There
Zooming and so
there
forth?
have been some modifications as a result of the pandemic, but still very limited, and probably not as great. I mean, I know, and Ms. Plucker was there, I think, and heard the debate a couple years ago when it happened, and Mr. Pendrell probably did as well. I know there was a lot of back and forth and a lot of compromise with some of the limitations that were made. I mean, the city of Omaha, as a city of the metropolitan class, was in a different position than some of the other cities as a result of some other statutory language. So,
And I also recognize that rural areas would be unfairly, they would have less connectivity until we really get the broadband rolling in rural areas completely. It would be unfair to hold electronic meetings for them on a statewide basis when a good portion of the rural areas might not be able to connect. But in the city of Omaha, given that we have a home rule charter, that we're in a different type of electronic connectivity circumstance, there should be, I think, then at the state level, some ability to convince them that where there is connectivity and fairly connected people, that we ought to be able to carry on the business of our city, particularly in the case of emergencies. The other question that I have regarded the same, what was it, 213, where it says that a vote of 6 members of the council or a unanimous vote if fewer than 6 members are present. Now, that would mean 2 people or 1 person could be unanimous. I believe we at least need to have that be the 4 members of quorum present.
There are other sections that require quorum.
That require quorum, but in this particular one, where it says a vote of the ordinance during such time as the state or city has declared an emergency. The vote of 6 members or a unanimous vote if fewer than 6 members are present.
yeah, so if there's 5 members, all 5 people have to vote. If there's 4 members, all 4 people have to vote for the emergency ordinance. Obviously, if there's 7, you only need 6.
But if there's only 2,
Well,
Then he wouldn't have a quorum.
you wouldn't have a quorum, you wouldn't been able to
so
conduct business.
this assumes quorum present.
Well,
Because right now, the way it's written, I would read it and I would translate it as, if fewer than 6 members are present.
Under the law of the state of Nebraska, the city council could not conduct business with 2 members or 3 members.
Maybe we need to be explicit in
Well-
these times of wordology and whatever that other game is called.
And the difficulty is, obviously, these are just individual charter sections, and they don't, we're looking at them in a vacuum as if they are individual without necessarily looking at the context of the surrounding ones or of the other things. So I appreciate, I mean, it's a fair question because you're obviously just looking at this particular thing in a vacuum, but the reality is, like in that particular case, we would not be able to conduct a meeting without having a quorum minimum of 4. So, though I understand you could try to make it explicit, the reality is,
To those who know the charter well, it doesn't need to be any more explicit. But to those who don't know the charter well and may be looking at just this section, I think being explicit isn't that hard of a thing to do, just by changing that to say 4 instead of 6. If there are fewer than 6, would say that you need to put in there the quorum then. Fewer than 6, but at least the quorum of 4.
I think you could simply add, all this is subject to the quorum requirement in whatever section it's in.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments?
Mr. Kratz, I guess just an open question for business, but would it make sense to refer section 2.10 to the correct subcommittee to come up with some proposed language, since there's been a couple of these now? And it makes sense to just streamline them down to one, since this doesn't conflict, but it would get wordy to combine this with the suggestion from the city council as well.
And I'm not suggesting that we combine these two sections, just that for the purposes of the hearing today, we combine them. And yeah, let me give that some thought. I'm not sure. I thought the subcommittees would look just at the public suggestions, but also I think at some point the subcommittees can also come up with their own suggestions, their own language if they want. And I think we can discuss that and work through that a little bit later. Okay?
And if you look at 2-10, which is actually the section before we were looking at, the last sentence of 2-10 makes clear that 4 members of the council shall constitute a quorum for all purposes. So that's, I mean, we could certainly make a reference to 213 to 2-10, but in this particular case, you have both sections there. All right.
Okay,
2-18, dealing with initiative petitions, and this is another request from the city clerk. And I think the first request, and I'm not sure how the election commissioner would respond to the request, but the request is that the initiative petition, that the election commissioner be the entity or the body responsible for determining the sufficiency of the signatures as opposed to the city clerk. So that's the first part of the request. And that the reference to each of the daily newspapers, which implies multiple newspapers, which would then, would be changed to designated newspaper. And I might suggest that we might want to, if we're going to make a change here, we may designate it to whatever we ultimately end up doing to 8-11, which is the section that dealt with newspapers as well as potentially requiring some type of online or other publication that we had that discussion obviously a few minutes ago. But if we're going to, in order to be consistent, if we're going to do that, this seems to say, you know, you have to define what the daily newspapers are in the county or in the city. There might be a disagreement between people as to what all of them are. I mean, we certainly are aware of the Daily Record. We're certainly aware of the Omaha World Herald. As to whether there's others that exist, there may be a difference of opinion, and someone might be able to challenge it on that basis. But I think the desire is to have a process that's consistent with whatever ends up with 8-11. If it's designated newspaper because it's not changed, then it's that. Or if we change 8-11, it would be whatever process would be good enough for other notifications.
Bernard, quick
Yes.
question here, Kennedy. Can the charter require the election commissioner to do something?
I would say probably not.
That's what I was thinking. And I understand why the clerk would want to do that, because all the information and the processes are done in Brian Cruz's office. I get that, but I don't know if we can necessarily do that, and that's the one thing, I don't want to be getting involved with something that state law doesn't currently allow. I'd leave that to the council to have the city lobbyists get the law changed, and then they can work on that, so.
Can't the, Bonnet here, can't the clerk, the city clerk, work with the election commissioner? I mean, I don't see why that can't be a team. Maybe roll it into saying that the clerk shall, within 20 days, verify with the aid of the election commissioner the sufficiency of, or in consult with the election commissioner. Because the election commissioner is the one with the data, right?
First of all, I think he still have the same issue. The election commissioner has to want to do it or be forced to do it some way.
But I think you're
Whether or not they
accurate.
have the data, I don't know. Clerk has the data.
I would likely work with the election commission on it, should I get a petition.
I mean, the reality is, I think you would have no choice as the city clerk to work with the election commissioner, whether it says it in here or not. And I, frankly, I wouldn't, though, as I think Mr. Kennedy raised, it would be interesting to have a charter section that required the election commissioner to do something that's not necessarily within his duties under state law. I also don't imagine that the election commissioner would have any objection to assisting the city clerk with doing it, but if the desire was to change the language, I think you'd have to make it clear that it was not mandatory.
Other comments? Comments from the public? Okay, next one, Bernard.
Well, again, this is 3.02. This is one I think you talked about last time as well. It's also item 5B on the election commissioners one, and this is changing the residency requirement from the office of the mayor from 5 consecutive years to 6 months. That's what it is.
I tell you, it just seems awful short for the mayoral position. It seems like somebody's going to be mayor ought to be here longer, but we're constrained by law, I think.
But we're a free country and we'll be able to change things if we have the will to do so.
If the legislature's willing to allow us.
If I had more
But for
power, I
right
might
now-
designate particular members of the convention to go give it their task, but I don't have that authority or power.
McPherson, sounds good, but for right now, our hands are tied.
Okay.
Comments from the public? Okay, let's go to the last one
All
from
right.
the city staff.
Section 8-01, again, was another request by the city clerk. At this point, anybody who is nominated to run for election has to fill out a petition and meet the requirements of this particular section. The request was that the signature requirement be removed for those that were seeking re-election to their position. Would not change the requirement relative to those that were seeking the position for the first time, but would only change it for those who had met the requirement before, been elected, and now are seeking re-election.
Comments?
Bonnet, unavoidably so. I'm a believer that we can't assume that an incumbent has enough support to be worthy of being on the ballot automatically. And I think that this step, if the incumbent has the support, should be a matter of days of an effort on the part of the incumbent. So I don't see why this would need to be changed. All things being equal and all candidates being equal, everybody should have to get their signatures.
This is Quinn. I just have a question. I kind of was thinking through that same thought process that if you take away those signatures, then does it become a significant number on the ballot without qualifications or support? And is it more of a nuisance, just a clog in the system?
But I think they're only talking about the incumbent.
Yeah.
So if you're
Oh, the
already the
incumbent.
incumbent.
Oh, okay.
Does
I'm
that
sorry.
person also need to get the signatures? And I would agree with Ms.
Okay,
Bonet
yeah,
on
yeah,
that.
I see.
Anything else from the public? Okay, that finishes
Item 4.
suggestions from the city staff. So I guess we'll go on to suggestions from the election commissioner.
And we've already really discussed sections A and B because they are duplicative of changes that were requested by the city clerk. So I'll move on to 5C, which is their request to make an amendment to section 8.01. And that concerns the nomination and election provision we just talked about, but they want to change, they would like a request that the candidate petitions be available at a certain period of time in the year prior to the primary election.
Why do you think they want that?
We have candidates request the petition sheets probably like a year and a half out.
Yeah.
And people move and the signatures become invalid at that point. So they need a set amount of time.
Yeah.
to release
I think what happens now is I think we end up giving out the thing later, this end of December, early January.
They don't release the petition forms, I don't think, until September of an election year, at the earliest.
Comments?
So what do you want to amend it to so that they get the petition forms sooner?
I think the Election Commission just wants to set a date because there's not one in there right now. And we'll have people come in and ask for it like maybe a year or 2 years before the election's even coming up. So they need a defined time to hand out those petitions.
So then they'd be available the first Monday in October before the primary election. The primary election is typically in April.
So 6 months.
So 6 months. As opposed to now, we have people asking 9 months, a year before.
Yeah, we could have someone ask today or tomorrow.
Yeah.
Other comments?
Finally, McPherson, finally something that makes sense. Okay, great, awesome.
It's a good comment. Any comments from the public? Okay, let's go on to, I guess we're done with the election. We're
I
done.
think the decision was, I wasn't here last time, so I had to talk the whole time this time. So I'm going to sit down now.
Okay. Next item on the agenda is any suggestions from the public? If not, I know on the website, we're taking suggestions up through, Bernard, help me.
June 10th.
June 10th, okay.
A week from tomorrow.
And it starts at 6 o'clock instead of 5.
Yeah.
And I would anticipate at that meeting, we'll meet together and then probably split up into our subcommittees. Or, let's see, June 10th is when the public has our deadline. The other option is we cancel the meeting and wait till the meeting after June 10th, when we get all the public comments.
It'll be redundant, McPherson, there's some redundancy, and I think your observation, Chair, is a good one, that either we, let the public comment without our commentary, right? And then we come back soon thereafter to combine those and assign them to the appropriate subcommittees.
Yeah, that's what I guess I envision, is that we'll take all the comments, assign them to the various subcommittees. Then we'll have the subcommittees go through the public suggestions and then come back to the entire committee and report back, essentially.
So we don't meet as a board on the 10th.
No, we don't. The timing's off a little bit,
Yeah.
and that's why I'm thinking that we cancel the meeting on June 6th.
And frankly, the suggestions could come up until midnight on June 10th. And then my intention would be, I've already started a kind of a one-page summary document just describing them, and I've attached each of the emails and/or letters that I received, the full body of it. And my intention would be to send that out to each and every one of you June 10th or June 11th, once they've all been received. And that gives you a little bit of time for the meeting that I can't remember if I think the meeting, June 13th. So that meeting is the next Monday. So I can commit to getting that stuff emailed out by the end of the day on June 10th, so that you have it over the weekend and all day Monday to review. And then
Bernard, if anything comes in after the end of day on Friday, will you just send it out as an addendum?
I can send it out. I mean,
Okay. I'm not sure
To
that
the
anything
extent
will.
that there's a misimpression, I mean, I basically have, including the people who made suggestions at the last meeting, who have included on the suggestions, 12, 13, 14 suggestions as of now, and several of those are duplicative of each other. I'd say there's probably 7 or 8 actual different suggestions to consider, so maybe not the number that you might anticipate.
I would be in, Kennedy here, I would be in favor of canceling the next meeting with the understanding that we would have it outlined, have it there, and then just keep in mind that if we have a lot of input, then we may need that July 14th meeting, but it is what it is. I'd rather have all the information than do it partially.
We also have the ability to schedule another meeting in that time period if that's the desire of the board. I mean, I set one a week just kind of unilaterally as if I were the king of the world, but obviously the board has the ability to make decisions about when they want to meet, and obviously you'd want to work with Mr. Kratz on that.
I guess let me ask you, are there any objections to canceling the next meeting on June 6th? Seeing none, it's canceled.
Great.
I'm not even going to take a vote. No, there isn't. Okay, any other business? Any comments from the public? West Dodge again. Are you going to repeat what he did? Are you going to repeat what he did before?
No, I
Same
just want
issues.
to ask a question
Okay.
on it from some more information. I will not wear you out with another. I know everybody wants to go home and we're
That's
we're
fine.
close to
Just-
time. West Dodge, I live at 175th and T Street. I haven't heard from anybody in regard to the ranked choice voting, whether or not we can do it. I was fortunate enough last night to be able to virtually attend a meeting that occurred with the San Diego process with their city charter. They are a Dillon's Rule state, which I believe we are as well. I don't know if you all know that factor, and I don't know if the attorneys have looked into that. I'm just asking a question as much as anything here, but apparently in a Dillon Rule state, in California, which is a Dillon's Rule state, a charter city is allowed to set laws and methods in regard to their own elections and their own election processes. It appears that that may be the case here as well, because we do our elections separate, at a separate time from the state and the federal elections. So I just wanted to point that out, suggest I think that's there. There was some discussion that the attorneys were going to look into it. It appears that charter cities in other states that use the Dillon's Rule system are doing this.
I would tell you, over the years, Dillon's Rule used to apply to Nebraska Supreme Court, enforced that on a number of cases. Recently, in some of the more recent cases with Lincoln, I think Lincoln particularly, the Supreme Court's gone away from the Dillon's Rule concept and more to, you have a charter and that gives you all the authority that you essentially need or want, with limitations from the state. So here in Nebraska, it's still a little bit in a flux.
So I think that leaves the door open. I just wanted to suggest that unless somebody has something else
Again,
different
we'll have to
say.
look at the election laws in the state.
Right.
Which might be pretty tight, I don't know. I haven't looked at them in a long time.
And I don't want to wear you out with more, but thank you for giving me a little time. I want to thank Mr. Pendrell for bringing up some wonderful things that I think needed light shined on them today. Thank you. I didn't know a lot about those things. I'm going to share some of that with some other people that might be able to make some noise in the legislature, but I guess you're in that position.
They're all online.
Okay.
That's
All right.
how
Well,
effective
some people
online
are
can be.
digging and some people aren't.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other public comments? If not, any comments for the good of the business? If not, we're adjourned.
I would like
guess
to
maybe
say
need a
that
motion,
we're,
I don't know.
we're working really well here, folks. If the public isn't impressed, I am.
Anybody else need parking? I think